Hollywood has always sold toughness. Square jaws, hard stares, a fist that never misses. But most of that is lighting, editing, and a stunt coordinator standing just out of frame. Every so often, though, a studio put a camera in front of a man who didn't need any of that, because life had already done the work. Coal mines, prison yards, battlefields, freight trains. By the time these men ever heard the word action, they'd already lived through things no script would dare invent. This is a countdown of 10 actors whose off-screen lives were at least as hard as anything they ever played, plus one modern name who might outdo all of them. Stick around, because the story behind number 2 is the kind of thing that sounds made up and isn't. And if you've got a guess for who takes the top spot, drop it in the comments before we get there. Robert Mitchum built a screen persona out of half-closed eyes and a voice that never rose. It read as boredom. It was actually mileage. Long before Hollywood, Mitchum was a teenage drifter riding freight cars across Depression-era America, taking whatever work he could find ditch digging, laboring in a South Carolina munitions plant, even boxing in small-time bouts, according to his own later recollections. At 16, he was arrested for vagrancy in Georgia and, by his own account, put on a chain gang for a short stretch before escaping. Whether every detail of that story survived exactly as he told it over the years is genuinely hard to pin down. Mitchum was known for polishing a good anecdote, but the bones of it, a hard adolescence spent surviving on the road, are well documented. That history didn't stay in his past. In 1948, at the height of his stardom, Mitchum was arrested and convicted for marijuana possession and served close to 2 months, part of it at a prison farm. Most careers would not have survived the scandal. His did. He returned to work without groveling for forgiveness, and if anything, his popularity climbed. Asked once to describe his acting method, he famously said he had 2 styles, with a horse and without a horse, a joke, but also a pretty accurate description of a man who refused to perform effort. Colleagues often said the same thing in different words. Mitchum wasn't trying to look dangerous. He simply didn't flinch on camera or off, and audiences could tell the difference. Charles Bronson's stillness on screen wasn't a technique. It was a permanent setting, installed early. Bronson was born Charles Buczynski, one of 15 children in a Lithuanian immigrant family in the coal country of Pennsylvania. Accounts of his youth describe grinding poverty, reportedly poor enough that he once wore his sister's dress to school because there was nothing else clean, and he went to work in the mines himself as a teenager. Earning $1 a ton for coal, he helped dig hundreds of feet underground. When the Second World War came, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces and served as a tail gunner on B-29 Superfortresses, flying missions over the Pacific, for which he was awarded the Purple Heart after being wounded. After his discharge, he cycled through the kind of jobs that don't leave room for softness: short-order cook, bricklayer, occasional amateur boxer, before drifting into acting almost by accident, initially cast for his physicality rather than any theatrical training. That background showed up in how he moved on screen, economical, unhurried, with none of the telegraphed showmanship other action stars relied on. Co-stars who worked opposite him in fight scenes often noted that his grip and his blocking had a realism that was hard to fake, because it wasn't being faked. When threats reportedly followed the release of Death Wish, a film that struck a nerve with real vigilante anxieties in 1970s America, Bronson was said to have shrugged them off rather than beefing up security. A man who, by that point in his life, had already outlasted worse. John Wayne spent decades playing men who couldn't be broken. It's a strange irony that the actual breaking, when it came, was medical rather than mythical, and he refused to let it show. Before stardom, Wayne worked his way onto the USC football team on a scholarship and took manual labor jobs around the Fox studio lot, moving props and furniture, when an injury ended his athletic ambitions. He built his early Hollywood career the hard way, through years of B-westerns, long before Stagecoach made him a star. What's often remembered now is what came later in his life. While filming The Alamo in 1959, he reportedly cracked ribs during a stunt and kept working through the pain rather than shut down production. In 1964, doctors removed his entire left lung along with 2 ribs after discovering lung cancer. He was back on a film set within months, doing physically demanding work in The Sons of Katie Elder, as though nothing had happened. and he continued making pictures for another 15 years. The darker chapter involves The Conqueror, a 1956 film shot largely on location near a Nevada nuclear test site, downwind of fallout from prior atomic testing. Of the roughly 220 cast and crew who worked on that production, a striking number, including Wayne, went on to develop cancer in the years that followed, a statistic that researchers and journalists have debated extensively since it's difficult to prove direct causation for any individual case. But the pattern struck many who studied it as too consistent to ignore. Wayne ultimately died of stomach cancer in 1979. Through it all, associates and even political rivals, like Kirk Douglas, who publicly disagreed with Wayne on almost everything else, spoke of him with genuine respect for the sheer physical stubbornness with which he kept working. James Cagney grew up fast on Manhattan's Lower East Side, in a neighborhood where the ability to defend yourself wasn't optional. He later said he'd been in more real street fights by his teens than most men see in a lifetime, and that early education shows up unmistakably in his screen work. What made Cagney's on-screen violence so convincing wasn't raw aggression, it was precision. Before he was ever a movie star, he trained and performed as a professional dancer, and that background gave his physical choreography, in fights as much as in his musical numbers, an economy of motion that read as authentically dangerous rather than theatrically staged. Directors who worked with him frequently noted that his punches looked different from other actors because he understood distance and timing the way a boxer or a dancer does, not the way an actor pretending to be either one does. Off-screen, Cagney had a reputation less for volatility than for quiet reliability, a man who, by most accounts from those who knew him, was more likely to end a confrontation with a joke than escalate one, but who nobody particularly wanted to test. As he aged, that presence didn't fade so much as concentrate, and even in his later, more restrained roles, there remained an unmistakable sense that Cagney had never really needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. Anthony Quinn's toughness had roots that predate his memory of forming them. He was born in 1915 amid the chaos of the Mexican Revolution, and his family relocated to the United States while he was still a small child, eventually settling in the working-class neighborhoods of East Los Angeles. Quinn grew up doing manual labor from a young age. Accounts describe him working construction and other physical jobs well before he was a teenager. And he also boxed as a young man, a period of his life he later credited with giving him both his broken nose and a certain comfort with physical risk that never left him. That comfort showed up decades later on film sets. During the making of Zorba the Greek in 1964, Quinn, already approaching 50, was known for insisting on doing physically demanding work himself, including scenes requiring heavy lifting that a stunt double would normally have handled. On the Guns of Navarone, climbing and cliffside sequences were similarly performed with minimal doubling, reportedly at his own insistence. What separated Quinn from a lot of his tough guy contemporaries was his willingness to pair that physicality with open emotional vulnerability on screen, weeping, breaking down, showing fear, without it ever undercutting the audience's sense that he could handle himself if things turned physical. That combination, rare among actors of his era, came less from training than from a life that had already required both toughness and grief in equal measure. Kirk Douglas built one of the longest careers in Hollywood history, and very little of it came easily. He was born to poor Belarusian Jewish immigrant parents in Amsterdam, New York, and grew up in genuine hardship, working odd jobs from childhood to help support his family. He wrestled competitively in high school and used that skill, along with sheer persistence, to work his way into college, St. Lawrence University, at a time when that kind of path was unusual for someone from his background. When the Second World War began, Douglas enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served on anti-submarine vessels in the Pacific Theater. He was injured during his service, reportedly in an incident involving depth charges, and received a medical discharge in 1944. On screen, Douglas had a reputation for insisting on doing as much of his own physical work as productions would allow. For Spartacus in 1960, a film he also produced, he trained extensively for the combat and gladiatorial sequences and pushed to make the fight choreography look genuinely brutal rather than stylized. But the story that arguably defines his toughness came much later in life. In 1991, In his mid-70s, Douglas survived a helicopter collision that killed 2 other people aboard a different aircraft. He sustained a serious back injury and recovered. Then, in 1996, he suffered a severe stroke that badly damaged his speech. Rather than retreat from public life, he spent years in speech therapy, eventually regained functional speech, and wrote about the experience in his book, My Stroke of Luck. Director Stanley Kubrick, who clashed with him repeatedly on Spartacus, nonetheless conceded that once Douglas decided something needed to happen on a production, it happened. A testament less to stubbornness than to a will that had already been tested by much worse than a difficult film shoot. Lee Marvin didn't need to act dangerous because he had already survived some of the worst fighting of the Second World War. Marvin enlisted in the United States Marine Corps as a teenager and fought in the Pacific Theater, including the brutal 1944 Battle of Saipan. During that campaign, he was wounded by machine gun fire that struck him in the lower back, severing a nerve and leaving him with lasting nerve damage. He spent over a year recovering in military hospitals and received the Purple Heart. He was one of relatively few men from his original unit to survive the campaign at all. That experience shaped his acting in ways critics and directors noticed immediately once he began working steadily in Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s. Rather than playing violence as spectacle, Marvin brought a flat, economical physicality to his roles as soldiers, criminals, and hitmen, men for whom violence was a tool, not a performance. It's part of what made his Oscar-winning turn in Cat Ballou, and his icy villainy in films like The Killers and Point Blank land so differently from his contemporaries. Off-screen, Marvin cultivated a reputation as a hard-living, hard-drinking presence. But those who worked with him consistently described the intimidation less in terms of aggression and more in terms of stillness. A man who had genuinely seen combat and simply didn't need to prove it to anyone in a room. Steve McQueen's childhood offered him almost nothing stable. Abandoned by his father and largely by his mother, he spent stretches of his youth in a California reform school for boys. And by his mid-teens, he was already living independently, drifting through a string of jobs and minor scrapes with trouble. He enlisted in the Marine Corps at 17, and his service was, by most accounts, a mix of real heroism and real insubordination. He was busted down in rank multiple times for disciplinary infractions and spent time in the brig for going AWOL. Yet during an Arctic training exercise, he is credited with helping save several fellow Marines after their amphibious tractor capsized in freezing water, an incident McQueen himself later described in interviews, and one broadly consistent with Marine Corps records of his unit's training accidents, though exact details vary between retellings. In Hollywood, McQueen became known and frequently criticized by studio insurers for insisting on performing his own stunts wherever possible. On The Great Escape, he did the vast majority of the motorcycle riding himself. The climactic fence jump was one of the rare exceptions, performed by his friend and stunt double Bud Ekins, because the production's insurers refused to allow McQueen to attempt it. He raced cars and motorcycles competitively in his off hours, sometimes under a pseudonym to avoid studio interference, and famously placed second overall at the 12 Hours of Sebring endurance race in 1970 while nursing a broken foot. Colleagues who worked alongside him on both film sets and the racetrack often said the same thing. McQueen wasn't performing recklessness for an audience. It was simply how he preferred to live. Charlton Heston spent much of his career embodying men of biblical and historical scale, Moses, Ben-Hur, El Cid, and he brought to those roles a physical discipline that came from real hardship, not just gym work. During the Second World War, Heston served in the United States Army Air Forces as a radio operator and aerial gunner aboard B-25 bombers stationed in the Aleutian Islands, a posting known for brutal weather rather than heavy direct combat, but demanding and dangerous in its own right. That period of military discipline stayed with him. On the set of The Ten Commandments in the mid-1950s, he insisted on carrying genuinely heavy stone tablet props through repeated takes rather than substituting lighter prop versions. A choice that left him with real physical strain, but that he felt served the authenticity of the performance. During The Greatest Story Ever Told, he reportedly tore ligaments in his shoulder during a stunt, and, rather than shutting down filming, had the injury treated and continued shooting the same day. Heston was also among the cast of The Conqueror, The same 1956 production shot near the Nevada test site that later affected John Wayne. He was later diagnosed with cancer and underwent treatment, including surgery, and continued to accept physically demanding roles afterward rather than retreating into lighter work, a pattern that friends and biographers frequently pointed to as evidence of a stubborn, almost military sense of duty to finish what he'd started, on a film set or otherwise. If there's one name on this list that makes the others look ordinary by comparison, it's Audie Murphy. And the wild part is that everything here is a matter of public military record, not studio invention. Murphy grew up desperately poor as one of many children of Texas sharecroppers, and he lied about his age to enlist in the Army after both the Navy and Marine Corps had turned him down for being too small and underweight. He was 5'5" and barely over 100 pounds when he shipped out. Over the next 3 years, he fought through campaigns in Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany, rising from private to a battlefield commission as second lieutenant. On January 26, 1945, near the town of Holtzwihr in France, his company came under attack by 6 tanks and advancing infantry. Murphy ordered his men to fall back to the cover of nearby woods, then climbed alone onto a burning, ammunition-loaded tank destroyer and used its mounted machine gun to hold off the German advance by himself for close to an hour, sustaining a leg wound in the process before his ammunition ran out. He then organized his men into a counterattack that drove the Germans back. That action earned him the Medal of Honor. By the time the war ended, he had received every valor decoration the United States military offered, including the Silver Star twice, and by most standard accounts he is credited, across the whole of his combat service, with killing, wounding, or capturing more than 240 enemy soldiers, making him the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. When Hollywood found him after his face appeared on the cover of Life magazine, the disconnect was immediate. He looked like a teenager, not a man who had personally held off a company of German infantry. Studio executives reportedly had to be convinced that the boyish young man in front of them was really the war hero they'd read about. When he eventually starred as himself in the 1955 film To Hell and Back, adapted from his own memoir, several of his real wartime actions were reportedly softened for the screen because they seemed too improbable for audiences to accept as fact. Behind the public image, Murphy struggled for the rest of his life with what would today be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress, including insomnia and nightmares that led him to sleep with a loaded pistol nearby for years. He spoke about it publicly at a time when almost no one did, pushing for the military and the public to take the psychological toll of combat seriously long before that became common. He never wanted to be remembered primarily as a war hero. He preferred the westerns and lighter roles he made later in his career, but the plain historical record of what he survived at 19 and 20 years old remains almost impossible to overstate. Every entry on this list comes from what's often called Hollywood's golden age. But one modern actor's real life arguably outdoes all of them, and it feels wrong not to mention him. Before he became a familiar face in films like Machete and Heat, Danny Trejo spent over a decade in and out of some of California's toughest prisons, including San Quentin and Folsom, on convictions tied to armed robbery and drug offenses. While incarcerated, he became a boxing champion within the prison system, fighting in the general population rather than any kind of protected environment. He got sober behind bars and after his release built a life around staying that way, working for years as a drug and alcohol counselor, a role that indirectly led to his acting career when he visited a film set to support a young man he was counseling through addiction. Trejo has been open about his decades of sobriety and has said plainly, in more than one interview, that at his age he'd rather leave the dangerous stunt work to professional stunt performers than risk injury, proving a point. It is a small, telling detail. A man with a genuinely hard-earned reputation who has nothing left to prove to anyone. That's the list, 10 men plus one, who didn't need a script to convince anyone they were tough, because the toughness came first, and the acting came later. They carried real scars, real medals, and in more than one case, real regrets, into performances that still hold up decades later precisely because so little of it was pretend. Which one of these stories surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you think today's action stars could hold a candle to this generation, We'd genuinely like to hear the argument. Subscribe for more deep dives into the real history behind Hollywood's biggest legends.